Hey, I'm ZSHPlays. Welcome to my nightmare. We're building our first ever Gharial habitat. It is fiendishly complex. There is a lot that we need to do. It is going to be very difficult to build. Can we do it? In an attempt to make this build more manageable, I'm introducing the Gharialometer. This scientifically accurate and incredibly complex device is the exact size of the male Gharials in the game, and it's going to let us measure out how big we want this complex to be. We want this habitat to fill this area at the front of the zoo here, with entrances from the Koala House, the restaurant, and one coming in all the way from this path over here behind the adventure playground. The build is based on the Gharial Breeding Centre at Prague Zoo. It's going to have an outdoor pool and an indoor pool so that in our Central European zoo they can be outside during the summer and have a sizable indoor house whenever the weather is not as good. Now, any build that combines water, paths and 4.5 metre long base game animals is going to be a challenge, and this is no exception. There's so many things I want in this build, but the main thing for me is for it to be realistic. I want it to look super realistic, fit in nicely with the rest of the zoo, and we'll get as many of the features in as possible. Some of them may have to fall by the wayside due to the aforementioned issues, but we will do the best we can. We'll start with the indoor area. Like I say, I want it to look realistic, but I also want them to be able to dive underwater so that we can get underwater viewing in. According to the game, that means we need the water to be at least 3 meters deep, which is a lot deeper than you would normally see in an indoor viewing area, but we'll start at that level and see what we can do. I want this habitat to fit perfectly into this area, and it's really important that we leave some space for the guests to get past the habitat. We don't want to force them to walk through the habitat and the indoor area to get to the next part of the zoo, which is going to be the all-important gift shop. We need to give them the option to walk past the habitat as well. So the way we're going to do that is to have the building with a diagonal wall so that one wall is perpendicular to the boundary wall of the zoo, and then the other wall comes in towards that. That will give us enough space to be able to put a path in so that the guests can walk past the habitat if they want to. Nothing more frustrating than trying to get from one part of a zoo to another and having to retrace your steps exactly through 15 habitats you've already seen because there's no sort of through path, so we definitely want to avoid that here. Let's start turning this into a habitat. So we'll dig the terrain out so that we can get the water in, and then we'll start putting the barriers in. I want curved glass barriers along the front here, so the little bit of land you see is where the guests are going to be. So we'll put one straight bit in so that we can get an angle, and then we'll switch to the curved glass, put a nice curve along here so it joins up with the entrance wall, and then we'll put the water in, make sure it's the right height for our Gharials. And then we'll use the Jeep transport to get a slope going down into the building so that the paths are a bit lower so that we can get the guests so that the surface of the water is just below head height. That should give them a really good view of the Gharials when they're on the surface. I've got to say, of all the Gharials I've seen in zoos, which isn't many, they're not that common in zoos and they're sadly very rare in the wild. I've seen this habitat at Prague Zoo, Zoo Leipzig, and a long time ago I saw them at San Diego Zoo, and I've never seen them underwater. They're always either chilling on the surface or they're sat on a sort of rock in the middle of the water. They like to bask. I imagine they're one of those animals that only really swims when they need to actually catch some fish, which is the only thing they eat. And along with most reptiles, if they don't have to move, they won't. That's the basic terrain done to get the guests down to the correct height. What we're going to do now is smooth that out using the flatten to surface tool to maintain the slope that we've put in there. We'll just make that a bit wider so it looks tidier. And then we'll go and put the actual paths in. So we'll hold down control so we can get one path exactly where we want it in that door, and then we'll run it alongside the habitat and then do the same thing at the other end so that we can get a kind of snaking path through there. And then we'll bring the path out to join on to the Koala House and the restaurant. And once we've done that, we can move on to the outdoor habitat. So we're going to have a much shallower pool here. The reason for the ridiculous measuring devices is we have to make sure that with the hitboxes on these animals in the game, it's going to be big enough for them to turn a complete circle in the water, otherwise they won't use it. And according to the crocodilian care manual that I was looking at, they need to be able to submerge themselves at least something like 7 inches or something under the water. So we'll make sure it's at least that deep. And then onto the clever bit, or so I thought. What I've done is put null barriers all the way around that habitat, and then these 2 glass barriers here that are holding the deeper water in, I've switched off the option for them to be habitat perimeters, which means this is all now one habitat. Now we're going to be feeding the Gharials in the indoor pool with the underwater fish feeder. It was my understanding that the keepers don't need to be able to actually touch that to feed it, obviously with it being underwater. What I didn't realise is that they do need to be able to access the pool of water that it's in, and having that pool completely surrounded by glass means they can't do that. and they won't fill it. Now at some point, and I've spared you this in the video, I spent literally hours turning this into 2 separate habitats, but no matter what I did, the underwater fish feeder stayed invalid in the options at all times. The keepers would never fill it and the gharials would never use it. And seeing as we're in sandbox mode, none of our animals actually need to eat anything, I've decided to just leave it as it is here because it looks good, the gharials in the game will be absolutely fine, and having the habitat look realistic is the top priority here. Let's start making things look a little bit nicer around here. So we'll start decorating the outside of this building, and inspired by Prague, what we're going to do is basically cover it in bamboo, which is going to be coming out at all sorts of crazy angles and different heights. So I placed it down with random rotation turned on, which makes it really easier to then just spin everything and it'll automatically go in a slightly different direction to all the others. And once we've got a nice arrangement of that, we'll just copy this around the building and make sure that the tallest parts of bamboo are above the level of the roof. Enables you to have a really simple build, just painted in go away green, and then a few bits of bamboo and some actual growing bamboo as well, and it starts to look really nice and just sinks away into the background and allows the guests to concentrate on the gharials, whether they're inside or outside. This bamboo is a bit yellow for my liking, so later on we'll switch that out for the FlexiColor bamboo so we can get more of a natural look to it. We're also going to add a way for the gharials to get from one pool of water to the other. The reason we have to use 2 pools is we've got 2 different water levels here, and you can't do that in Planet Zoo. I imagine in real life you could just sort of drain one of the pools so it was down to the level of the other one or something like that, but no facility to do that in Planet Zoo. So we've got 2 separate pools, and then we'll just use one of those animal doors in there to make it look like you could open it and get them from one to the other. Time for some text. So I've made a little bit of typography for the front of it using one of Christina's amazing fonts. I just want it to have a line underneath it, like Asian text often does. So we're going to use the front side of these hinges, which is what this entire font is made out of, just to create a line that goes under the word gharial, just brings it together, makes it look really good. And then we'll move on and start getting the paths to look a bit better. I've gone with the wooden board paths here to match what I saw at Prague, but the curbs on them are absolutely enormous, as they always are in Planet Zoo. So we're going to make our own using these Indonesian timber planks. We'll just sink them down into the ground on their thinnest side, and then run them along and make sure they always match up both with the curve and the height of the path. And then we can move on to the walls. I've dug into the tropical building kit for this one. We've got this beautiful wall I originally built for a Balinese habitat in San Bernardino Zoo, but I think it'll work really nicely as an Indian wall as well with a few modifications. So we'll start with this as a base, and then we'll just remove some of the more obviously Indonesian elements, change the colour a little bit, and get it looking more Indian. At the real habitat, there's a combination of a fence and a hedge at the side of this habitat, but neither of the hedge pieces that we have in the game were really working for me, didn't really look the way I wanted, so I thought we'd go with something a bit more original instead. We'll have some curved glass viewing for the guests here, just experimenting with which end to place it in to get the nicest curve, and then we'll use our mud walls for the back of the habitat, do a bit of recolouring on the wall, add in some more Indian elements in and around it, especially that little temple piece over the keeper gate. And there we go, habitat's starting to come together. Before we move on, let's leave this area for a second because we have some very cute new arrivals in the forest. Firstly, our red deer have had 2 fawns. They are as adorable as you would expect. A couple of little Bambis running around in the habitat. I did a little bit of work on this just before I filmed this little section, just to make sure that the views into the other parts of the zoo were obscured where I want them to be and visible where we want them to be, so you can see a few of the other buildings poking through, like the pygmy hippo house. Now we've also got some cute little piglets or hoglets in the wild boar habitat as well. Right, time to get back to the gharial habitat because we're going to invent a new technique for lining water. This is African kiln number 2. And I've been looking for a new way of lining the artificial ponds in the zoo. I didn't expect this would be the piece I was using, but if you combine them in the right way, you get a really interesting texture. Look at all the little cracks on it. It looks like concrete or plaster or mud, the exact kind of thing that zoos would use to line ponds like this. You have to be very careful with them because they have animated sparks and smoke coming out of them. But if you're using them underwater and you make sure that the oven part of it isn't at the front, then it actually works really nicely. Always fun finding a new piece to use, especially one as niche as an African kiln. We drop this down into here, so we've just got the top of it poking out, and then copy it along, just rotating it every time so we get different shapes and different textures going on. We get a really sort of natural yet man-made look to the join between the land and the water. It's tricky to work with, but I think it's pretty successful. We'll just get one more in at the end here, and then we'll leave the bit to the right of it a bit more natural looking and sandy. This bit's just under the water, that's fine. If we zoom out and take a look at it, looking pretty good. Now that we've got those all done, we'll just use a few pieces of the mud panels colored to look like sand and some buffalo grass to complete the join and get everything looking finished. Now we can move on to getting some more visual interest into the habitat. So we're going to take this log and have this sticking up out of the water onto the land, and then take some of the arrangements of plants that we've made for the rest of this area. You can see them next to the path there. Just place one of those into the habitat, and then we'll move on to the indoor habitat and start getting that done. If you like the thumbnail to this video, that's based on a photo of a gharial in the real habitat, and I want to make sure we can get a perfect recreation of that here. So we've got the giant fake tree, and we're going to put some liana vines around it, just playing around with the different vines until we get an arrangement that looks nice, that kind of goes around the tree and then down into the water. We'll add some branches in as well, using a mixture of the climbing branches and one of the faux branches. And while we're here, we'll start using the same arrangement that we used to line the pond on the outside to add some land into this part of the habitat as well, so the gharials have somewhere to go that's out of the water. Now that we've got it with a mud panel on top of it, it's really easy to just place that down and spin it around, get that to fill in the space that we want, and then we'll use one of our usual rock formations underneath it to join it onto the floor of the habitat. And then we'll get back to the sort of photo area that we're trying to recreate exactly and start filling it with some more foliage. We're going to place down multiple copies of the smallest banana palm to create a slightly custom plant there. And then we'll use some of the basket ferns up on the wall to start filling that space in. We want this to be really dense. We're going to have to use billboards with images of plants on for the majority of this wall, just to make sure there's enough space for the gharials to get onto the land because they're hitbox. But this bit at the end, we'll sort of sacrifice their space there and use that to get some really nice planting in. Some vines, some roots, a few scaevola bushes, and we'll just get a really impressive little visual area, which will be the first thing that the guests see as they come into the habitat. Speaking of the guests, their half of this building is still a mess, so we need to tidy that up. So we'll go in with some of the Indonesian brick panels and use those to create a floor. Just recolor those. We've got some terrain changes in this area, so we can't use the normal floors or their feet are going to disappear. We'll use the panels so that we can line it perfectly and get a floor that looks solid but actually follows the contours of the terrain. And then we'll cover up the panels in the glass with some bamboo. Seen this in, I think it's Singapore Zoo. I think they use steel supports to hold the glass up, and then some big hollow bamboo wrapped around the steel, so it looks like the glass is just being held up by little bits of bamboo. It's a nice little effect. We'll put some trim in as well, of course. Can't build anything without trim. That'll sit everything together nicely and make it look even more realistic. We won't use the actual plaster trim piece for this. We use one of the wider plaster pieces so that it's visible on both the guest and the gharial side of the habitat, and then it's onto the roof. We want to get some natural light into the gharial side of the habitat, so it's darker on the guest part than the gharial part for better viewing. So we'll use some of the modern glass pieces to create some skylights, and then we'll fill the rest of it in with some of the grass panels so we can get a bio roof up here. We'll use some of the plaster panels to create a ceiling on the inside, and again we'll make sure those are nice and dark. We've got some of our favourite copper pieces to create the walls, and then I thought it'd be fun to get some running water in here as well, so we'll use some of the waterfall pieces to line the bottom of the walls along with some more of the bamboo that we used on the outside. We'll recolour those so they fit in nicely, and then it's on to the final touches. Put in some massive screens at the back and put some forest on there. That'll bring it to life without interfering with the gharial's hitboxes. We're going to place a green light up by this tree so we can get the green glow that you see in the thumbnail, and then finally, having discovered that there is absolutely no way we can get the gharials to swim underwater here without making it even larger than it is, and it's already bigger than I want it to be, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we no longer need 3 meters of water depth, bring the floor up to a much more realistic level, fill it in with plants and rocks, and we're done. Let's check out the habitat. I love, by the way, the directional signs that we have throughout the zoo now. Well worth the 600 pieces each that they are every time we place one down. And here's the gharials. The males are absolutely enormous. I've never seen a gharial anywhere near this big in zoos. Definitely the most bizarre looking of the crocodilians, but they've been one of my favourite animals ever since I was a little kid. I saw a David Attenborough documentary about gharials, and they're just so bizarre. I absolutely love them. The only reason we've never built for them on the channel is building a realistic Gharial habitat in franchise mode is impossible. They need a massive land area, and they spend half their time running around on the land, which is something they physically can't even do in real life because their legs don't really work like that. So it needed to be in sandbox mode so we could keep them in the water 99% of the time. Despite the issues and the lack of underwater swimming, I'm actually pretty happy with how this one turned out. Let's take a look at where we started today, and just by the entrance you can see the Gharial habitat coming in. We've got a big long path next to it as well that will take people past it, round to the adventure playground, the gift shop, and whatever else we might be able to squeeze in up there. Thank you all so much for watching as always. Thank you to those of you who've joined the Explorers Club. Channel members have a little treat on the channel now. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you again soon for some more Planet Zoo. Bye.